Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today we are going to discuss disorders of the pituitary gland, and the most common disorder that give rise to the hyperpituitarism or hypersecretion or oversecretion of the pituitary hormones is the pituitary adenoma. We know that the pituitary gland is the master gland. It is under the control of the hypothalamus, and it is divided into anterior pituitary gland and posterior pituitary gland, also called adenohypophysis, anterior pituitary, and neurohypophysis, the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary gland produces different hormones under the influence of the hypothalamus, and these are the growth hormone produced by the somatotrope cells, adrenocorticotropic hormone produced by the corticotrope cells, the prolactin associated with milk synthesis and secretion produced by the lactotrope cells, the thyroid stimulating hormone which causes secretion of thyroid hormones from the thyroid gland T3 and T4 is produced, the TSH under the influence of the hypothalamus is produced by the thyrotrope cells. The gonadotrope cells produce gonadotropic hormones, the follicular stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone. The posterior pituitary gland produces and secretes two hormones, the antidiuretic hormone and the oxytocin. These two hormones are synthesized in the paraventricular and supraoptic nuclei of the hypothalamus, and they are just stored in the posterior pituitary gland, which when needed and stimulated are released into the bloodstream. A simple mnemonic for to remember the pituitary hormone is the goat flaps. Growth hormone, oxytocin and ADH produced by the posterior pituitary, thyroid stimulating hormone, follicular stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone and prolactin. The hypothalamus releases mostly the stimulating factors for the pituitary hormones, but there are at least two inhibitory factors. For prolactin, the inhibitory factor is the dopamine, prolactin inhibitory factor, and it is secreted throughout, but it is only during breastfeeding when the secretion of dopamine is inhibited, and it allows prolactin from the anterior pituitary to be secreted for the synthesis and secretion of milk for the newborn baby. Another inhibitory hormone, in contrast to the stimulating hormone known as the growth hormone releasing hormone, its inhibitory hormone is the growth hormone inhibitory hormone known as the somatostatin. With the exception of these two inhibitory hormones, the hypothalamus secretes the stimulating or releasing factors, and under the influence of these releasing and stimulating factors, the posterior pituitary secretes hormones. Hormones of the anterior pituitary secretes hormones. The hormones of the posterior pituitary, namely the ADH antidiuretic hormone or vasopressin and the oxytocin, they are synthesized in the hypothalamus. and they are just stored in the posterior pituitary gland, which when needed will be secreted into the bloodstream. Hyperpituitarism is a condition in which there is excess hormone secretion by the pituitary gland. The most common cause of hyperpituitarism is the pituitary adenoma, particularly the adenoma of the anterior pituitary gland. Adenoma is a benign tumor that occurs in the anterior pituitary gland, and as I said, it is the most common cause of hyperpituitarism, but there are some less common causes also in which simple pituitary hyperplasia sometimes may cause excess release of the pituitary hormones. Malignant tumor like pituitary carcinoma may be the cause of excess hormone secretion, and sometimes the tumors that develop outside the pituitary gland somewhere in the body tissues cause ectopic hormone secretions, and rarely disorders of the hypothalamus, particularly that are seen in head injuries and uh, tumors of the brain and other conditions associated with abnormalities in the brain and hypothalamus, may be the cause of hyperpituitarism due to increased secretion of the releasing factors by the hypothalamus. Now we know that the pituitary gland contains many cells known as the Trop cells. So adenoma may involve somatotrop cells, it may involve lactotrop cells, it may involve thyrotrop cells, it may involve corticotrop cells. So we classify adenomas of the pituitary on the basis of the cells involved. Moreover, an adenoma in the pituitary gland may be functional or non-functional. If it is non-functional, it will not be secreting excess pituitary hormones, and it will produce its effects just because of the presence of an enlarged pituitary gland or a mass. But mostly the pituitary adenomas are functional, and they also, in addition to the mass effects, they also produce excess hormones. Mostly pituitary adenomas are sporadic. By that we mean here and there and rare. But some pituitary adenomas are associated with genetic mutations that may run in families. And only 5% of the adenomas are associated with familial genetic mutations. If a pituitary adenoma is less than 1 centimeter, then it is microadenoma, and it will need just observation. But if it is more than 1 centimeter, then this is a macroadenoma, and it will need surgical removal by the neurosurgeon. As I said, that pituitary adenoma, particularly functional adenoma, are tumors of the hormone producing cells of the pituitary gland. And adenoma, as its name indicates, noma, it is a benign tumor, and mostly it does not invade the nearby tissues or distant metastasis. The adenoma may be functional or non-functional. If it is non-functional, it will produce its effects due to compressing of the nearby surrounding structures. The functional adenomas, the most common pituitary adenomas that are functional, are the prolactinoma or adenoma of the lactotrop cells, which is the first most common tumor that produces prolactin, and it will give rise to galacturia and abnormal menstrual cycles in a female. The second most common adenoma is the adenoma that arises from the somatotroph cells and that will produce growth hormone. Growth hormone, when secreted in excess in a young man, when the bone epiphysis has not still closed, it will result in the condition known as the gigantism, abnormally long posture. But in people in which the epiphysis of the long bones have closed, there will be no change in the length of the person, but it will lead to another condition, and there will be increased flattening of the bones and soft tissues, and the condition that is known as the acromegaly. Corticotroph adenoma, which secretes adrenocorticotropic hormone, and that will stimulate the adrenal gland to cause excess secretion of cortisol, is the third most common adenoma that arises in the pituitary gland. Adenoma arising in the thyrotroph cells or gonadotroph cells will cause excess secretion of the thyroid hormone or hyperthyroidism and abnormalities in the sex organs and sex characteristics. These tumors are comparatively rare. Prolactinoma, which is the most and first most common tumor of the pituitary gland in a female, it will lead to secretion of milk. Normally, secretion of milk occurs only after childbirth, when the mother is breastfeeding. But if the secretion of milk occurs from the breast when the mother is not breastfeeding, or if she is not pregnant, it may indicate the prolactinoma. And abnormal secretion of the prolactin that will cause milk secretion, a condition known as the galactorrhea. Secretion of milk with in a time when the mother is not breastfeeding. It will also lead to abnormalities of the menstrual cycles and may cause amenorrhea. In the male, it may stimulate the secondary female sexual characteristics, and there may be enlargement of the breast, a condition known as the gynecomastia. And it may also inhibit the testosterone secretion, and the male may suffer from loss of libido. The second most common adenoma is the somatotroph adenoma, which in a young boy will result in the gigantism, where the bone epiphysis has not closed. But in adults, where the epiphysis of the long bones have been closed, it will give rise to acromegaly. And there will be excess visceral tissue growth and sometimes cardiomegaly, enlargement of the heart. The third most common adenoma is the corticotroph adenoma, which secretes excess adrenocorticotropic hormones that will cause the Cushing disease by stimulating the adrenal glands and causing excess secretion of the cortisol. That will appear in the particular features that are associated with Cushing disease, like moon faces, buffalo hump, and truncal obesity, as can be seen in the picture. Moon faces, buffalo hump, and truncal obesity. If the excess secretion of cortisol is because of the pituitary, it is called Cushing disease. But if it is due to some other reason, or if the problem lies in the adrenal gland, like adrenal gland adenoma, or if it is due to ACTH secretion from an ectopic tumor, then this is known as the Cushing syndrome. The TSH secreting and GnRH secreting adenomas of the pituitary gland are rare. Now, as I mentioned, that the clinical presentation of the pituitary disease may be in the form if the adenoma is functional or if it is non-functional. In functional adenoma, where the adenoma or the tumor is secreting excess hormones, it will lead to hyperpituitarism, excess secretion of the hormones, and in some diseases of the pituitary gland, particularly when the gland becomes atrophic, there will be hypopituitarism or under secretion of the pituitary hormones. The mass effects of the tumors, in addition to their functional effects that are associated with excess secretion of the pituitary hormones, so the mass effects will result in abnormalities of the sella turcica. As we know that the pituitary gland is located and confined to the bony space known as the sella turcica, so if a tumor develops and if it becomes enlarged, it will cause cellular expansion and sometimes it may lead to bony erosions. Optic chiasm is lying very close to the pituitary gland, and if the tumor becomes enlarged and if it causes compression or pressure over the optic chiasm, it may lead to visual field abnormalities like bilateral temporal hemianopia or tunnel vision. Sometimes the presence of mass in the cranium may cause elevated intracranial pressure and it may result in headache, nausea, and vomiting. Sometimes the enlarged adenoma may extend into the base of the brain and may result in seizures, obstructive hydrocephalus. If the tumor compresses the cranial nerves, it will lead to cranial nerve palsy. For example, if the facial nerve is pressed, it will give rise to the Bell palsy. A very serious condition that sometimes occurs in pituitary adenoma is known as the pituitary apoplexy, and that is bleeding inside the tumor, which causes sudden and excess enlargement of the tumor and which can be a lethal condition if steps are not taken on emergency basis, particularly the neurosurgical procedures. Now, what causes pituitary adenoma? We know that any growth or tumor is the result of genetic mutations. The cellular proliferation or division or mitotic cell divisions, they are well controlled through the cellular cell cycle. And there are genes, proto-oncogenes and tumor suppressor genes that will regulate and control cellular proliferation. Particularly, the cells with mutated DNAs are not allowed to proliferate. And the tumor suppressor genes, they will force the cells with mutated DNA to DNA repairing workshop, or if the DNA cannot be repaired, then the cells are forced to undergo apoptic cell death. Some known genetic mutations in the pituitary adenoma, the most common is the mutations in the GNA is one gene that code for the alpha subunit of the G protein coupled receptor system. We know that the peptide hormones, they do not enter the cell, but in fact they bind to a G protein coupled receptor in the membrane of the cell, and here further function is designed to the receptor. The receptor changes and it causes further changes by stimulating the second messenger system inside the cell, and this is the second messenger system which will lead to ultimately expression of genes in the nucleus and production of excess structural and functional proteins that will perform the required and desired effect that is supposed to be done by the hormone. The G couple protein receptors has a G protein known as the GS, stimulatory G proteins. This G proteins has three subunits, alpha, beta and gamma. And normally this receptor or this receptor proteins remains in an inactive form. But when it is stimulated by hormones like growth hormone and adrenocorticotropic hormone, what happens that upon stimulation, the GDP guanine diphosphate, which is attached to the alpha subunit of the G stimulatory protein, it dissociates and is converted into GTP. Now, the G couple protein with GDP is the active or stimulatory form. It will activate the second messenger system. For example, it will activate the adenyl cyclase. Adenyl cyclase activation will cause excess formation of the cyclic AMP, and it will lead to expression of genes that will cause cellular proliferation, increased hormone synthesis, and increased hormone secretion. But this activation of this inactive G protein to the active stimulatory protein is very transient. Here lies an enzyme known as the GTPase. This enzyme will convert the GTP into GDP, and the protein receptor is again turned inactive. So it is only the time when the receptor protein is stimulated by the hormones like growth hormones and ACTH. So when it is stimulated, it will become activated and will activate the second messenger system to perform the desired functions. As soon as the GTPase enzymes convert GTP into GDP, the proteins becomes inactive again. But what happens when the gene GNAS1 is mutated? And this GNAS1 gene codes for the alpha subunit of this G protein. So when it becomes mutated, it doesn't respond to the GTPase. And during this mutation, the GTPase associated conversion of the GTP into GDP stops. So what happens when the GTP is not converted into GDP? The active protein is not converted into its inactive form, and it remains continually stimulated. And this constitutional and continual stimulation of the active protein will cause continued stimulation of the second messenger system, and there will be abnormal uncontrolled cellular proliferation that will lead to pituitary adenoma. The genetic abnormalities that are studied in pituitary adenoma, one is the mutation in the alpha subunit that I explained in the previous slide, which lead to constituted activation of the stimulatory G protein and persistent and uncontrolled cellular proliferation. However, for the genetic association of pituitary adenomas, where the adenoma run in families and that make only 5% of the adenomas, pituitary adenomas, the rest of the pituitary adenomas, they occur sporadically. So in the 5% of the familial genetic adenomas, some genes have been identified, particularly those including the multiple endocrine neoplasia gene 1. multiple endocrine neoplasia 1 gene mutation. Other gene mutations are also identified. However, adenomas differ from each other in their behavior. Some are very slowly growing and some have got very aggressive behavior. And it has been seen that those adenomas in which there is mutation of the tumor suppressor gene TP53. So P53 gene, which is a tumor suppressor gene, its mutation, if it occurs in an adenoma, the adenoma will be more aggressive in behavior and it will cause rapid and early invasion, and mostly it will be associated with recurrence even if it is surgically removed. The gross morphology of the adenoma, since it is a benign tumor, so it is well circumscribed, soft lesion, and mostly if it is a microadenoma, it will be confined to the sella turcica, the bony erosion. But if it is a macroadenoma that is more than 1 centimeter in diameter, it will cause compression of the optic chiasm and will result in disturbances of the vision, bilateral temporal hemianopia or tunnel vision, and sometimes it may compress the surrounding structures, it may erode the sella turcica, and it may extend into the brain stem and may cause hydrocephalus and increase intracranial pressure. However, adenoma being a benign tumor, we consider it to be a well encapsulated tumor. But some adenomas exist that are non-capsulated and they will have a malignant tumor-like behavior and they will infiltrate the adjacent tissues. On gross examination, we may see hemorrhages inside an adenoma, and in some areas due to compressions the cell may undergo necrotic cell death, and this is particularly seen in larger adenomas. Microscopically, the pituitary adenoma, they are composed of uniform polygonal cells and they may be arranged in sheets, cards, or sometimes they may form papillary projections. One very important point to remember that in adenomas, the connective tissue, which is known as the reticulin, comparative to the cells, this reticulin network is very little and sparse. The nuclei of the neoplastic cells may have different appearances. For example, they may be uniform or they may present with different structures known as pleomorphic. Now coming to the cytoplasm, the appearance, microscopic appearance of the cytoplasm will depend upon the types of cells that carry the adenoma. If the growth hormone producing cells like somatotrophs or prolactin producing cells like lectotrophs, they in the cytoplasm behave like a base. They have basic characteristic and they will take the acidophilic stain, which is the eosine stain, hematoxylin eosine stain that we commonly use in the histopathology lab for staining cells. So the somatotrophs and lectotrophs adenoma, they will appear pink because they will take the acidophilic eosine stain. In contrast, adenomas that arise in the thyrotroph cells or gonadotroph cells or corticotroph cells, they have acidic characteristic and they will bind to the basic dye, the hematoxylin. So they are basophilic and they will appear blue under the microscope. Some adenomas do not contain the trop cells and they appear light yellow and they are known as the chromophobic. Whatsoever, but the appearance will be either acidophilic or the appearance may be basophilic and sometimes it may be chromophobic with no color. Mitotic activity in pituitary adenoma, since it is a benign tumor, usually the rapid mitotic activity is seen in malignant tumors where the cells are very rapidly dividing. So this is a benign tumor. So mostly the mitotic figures, they are not very prominently seen and the mitotic activity is comparatively scanty. However, there are some adenomas, particularly those adenomas that carry the p53 gene mutations. They are very aggressive and they may show rapid mitotic activity and excess proliferation of the cells, and for that reason they are also known as the atypical adenomas. Under the microscope, this is the normal appearance of a pituitary gland. We know that the pituitary gland contains thyrotropes, somatotropes, corticotropes, gonadotrop cells. So, and as I mentioned in the previous slide, that some tropes are acidophilic and some are basophilic. So, when we see a normal pituitary gland under the microscope, after we have stained it with the hematoxylin and eosine stains, we may see multiple colors. Some trop cells will appear pink, other trop cells will appear blue, and there will be excess connective tissue or reticulin network present among the populations of cells. But in an adenoma, which may involve only one trop cells, for example, somatotrop cells, plectotrop cells, gonadotrop cells. So, if it involves the acidophilic trop cells, it will appear pink, and this pink appearance and pink colored cytoplasm of the cells, it will be uniform. However, the nuclei may be uniform or they may be pleomorphic with different appearance of different nuclei. So here in this picture of the pituitary adenoma, it is contrast to this picture of the normal pituitary network, and also we can see that there is no reticulin or connective tissue network as that we see here in the normal pituitary adenoma in its microscopic appearance. This is an enlarged pituitary adenoma. Fortunately, it is non-functional and it has grown a large and it is compressing the surrounding brain tissue, and mostly the non-functional adenomas are macroadenomas and enlarged, and most of them have their effects due to their physical presence of a mass of tissue. For example, they may compress the optic chiasm and will lead to visual disorders of the vision. They may compress the cranial nerves and will lead to paralysis. For example, if they compress the facial nerve, they will cause Bell palsy. Sometimes they compress the brain stem and can cause hydrocephalus, and the best option for these non-functional macroadenoma is the surgical removal through neurosurgical procedures. Now coming to diagnose First of all, if we suspect a pituitary disorders, we will concentrate on the sign, symptoms, and physical examinations. Then we will investigate the presence of mass and the functionality of the adenoma. Either it is functional, it is secreting hormones, or if it is non-functional. So for evaluation of the mass, we will do computer tomography, CT angiography, magnetic resonance imaging, and here we will see that if the adenoma is more than 1 centimeter in diameter, then the treatment is surgical removal. If the adenoma is non-functional and if it is less than 1 centimeter in diameter, or if it is a microadenoma, then we wait and observe the patient. At regular repeated intervals, we will do CT MRI, and we will see that either the adenoma is growing or if it is the same. So we will deal the patient accordingly. If it is not growing and if it is less than 1 centimeter and if it is not producing signs and symptoms, then we will just observe it. Now, for functional adenoma and for adenomas that secrete hormones, we will make biochemical investigations for the assessment of the hormone levels in the blood or their metabolites. So we will see for that, is there overproduction of the hormones, or in some conditions there may be under secretion or under production of the hormones. So for overproduction, we will use drugs that will antagonize or neutralize the hormones, so giving a relief to the patient from the signs and symptoms. And if there is underproduction of the hormones, then we will use certain medicines that act as agonists, just like their effect is similar to that of the hormone, and we will use to the agonist supplementations or hormonal replacement to give the patient relief from signs, symptoms, and complications, and we will observe the response, and we will repeat at regular intervals the levels of the hormones, their metabolites in the serum, to make an assessment of the patient condition. The summary was: hyperpituitarism is mostly caused by pituitary adenoma. Adenoma less than 1 centimeter in diameter, and if they are non-functional, they just need observation. And microadenoma, which are producing mass lesions and have their effects due to the presence of an enlarged mass, the best treatment for them is surgical removal. And the excess production of the hormones are associated, depending upon the which hormone is produced. It is a growth hormone, it is a gonadotropic hormone, or if it is a corticotropic hormone. So symptoms and signs, they differ with the hormones produced by a pituitary adenoma. Genetic mutations mostly occur in the alpha subunit of the G protein coupled receptors, and the gene GNASI is the gene that encode for the alpha subunit of the G protein coupled receptors. The morphologically, as I mentioned, that cellular monomorphism, if it is a growth hormone adenoma, it will appear pink, all the cells, since they are acidophilic and they will take the ocean stain. And in other condition, if the cells are basophilic, they will take the blue stain and will get stained with hematoxylin and whatsoever. And the cellular monomorphism is a characteristic of the adenomas. However, some adenomas do not contain the trop cells, and they are known as uh, chromophobic. The other characteristic of the morphological appearance under the microscope of a pituitary adenoma will be the sparse or very little reticulin network. Thank you very much.